Hi, my name's Elena. And when my dad told me, "You're capable, you'll make your own way," what he really meant was, "We gave everything to your brother and nothing to you." Not the farmhouse where Grandpa taught us to fish, not his Purple Heart medal collection, not even the antique pocket watch he carried through 3 tours in Vietnam. The worst part? They acted like it was completely normal. They just pretended I didn't exist in his legacy. But I found something they thought was buried forever. And when the lawyer read it out loud in that stuffy conference room, my parents' faces turned white as hospital sheets. Before we dive deep into this mess, tell me something. Have you ever felt like your own family looked right through you when it came to what really mattered? Like you were good enough to help, good enough to sacrifice, but not good enough to inherit what was rightfully yours? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story is for everyone who was treated like the backup plan in their own family. I never expected to be sitting in Attorney Morrison's oak-paneled office on a Tuesday afternoon, in March, watching my parents divide up my grandfather's entire life like they were splitting a dinner check. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany conference table that probably cost more than my car. My mother sat with her hands folded perfectly in her lap, the same way she'd sat through every family dinner, where she'd praised my brother Marcus for breathing while ignoring my accomplishments. My father kept checking his phone, probably calculating how quickly they could wrap this up and get back to their real priorities. Marcus lounged in his chair like he owned the place, which, apparently, he now did. His designer suit was wrinkled. From his latest business trip to nowhere important, funded by the trust fund our parents had been feeding since he graduated college with a degree in partying and networking, he'd barely visited Grandpa in the last 5 years, too busy chasing get-rich-quick schemes and Instagram followers to spend time with the man who'd raised 3 kids on a mechanic's salary after coming home from war. Meanwhile, I'd been the one, driving to Grandpa's house every Sunday for the past decade. I was the one who learned to make his favorite beef stew when his arthritis got too bad for him to cook. I was the one who sat with him during his chemotherapy sessions, holding his hand while he told me stories about fixing tanks in the jungle, and how he'd promised his fallen buddies he'd make it home to build something good. I was the one who helped him organize his military medals and photographs, listening to every story behind every ribbon and commendation. But none of that seemed to matter now. Attorney Morrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the personality of wet cardboard, cleared his throat and began reading from what he claimed was Grandpa's final will and testament. According to this document, everything went to Marcus. The 80-acre farm that had been in our family for 3 generations. The classic 1967 Mustang that Grandpa had restored by hand in his garage, teaching me how to change oil and rebuild carburetors on weekends when I was 12. The collection of vintage military memorabilia that told the story of not just his service, but his father's service in World War II and his grandfather's service in World War I. Even the small things that should have been mine were listed under Marcus's name. The leather-bound journal where Grandpa had written down family recipes and stories from his childhood. The handmade wooden jewelry box he'd crafted for me when I turned 16, carved with my initials and filled with my grandmother's pearls. The first edition books he'd been collecting since the 1970s, many of which we'd found together at garage sales and used bookstores during our Saturday adventures. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I wasn't allowed to question what was happening. Grandpa always said the farm would go to whoever took care of it. I'm the one who's been maintaining the property, fixing the fences, making sure the barn doesn't collapse. My mother gave me that look, the one she'd perfected over 32 years of making me feel like I was asking for too much. "Elena, sweetheart, your grandfather changed his mind. He wanted Marcus to have the responsibility. You know how these things work in families. The oldest son carries on the legacy. But I wasn't the youngest. Marcus was only 18 months older than me, and Grandpa had never been the type of man who believed in that old-fashioned gender nonsense. He'd been the one to teach me how to shoot, how to fish, how to change a tire, how to stand up for myself. He'd been the one who told me stories about the women who'd served as nurses and pilots during his war, about how courage didn't have a gender and neither did honor. Attorney Morrison shuffled through his papers with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The will is quite clear, Miss Hendricks. Your grandfather left specific instructions about the distribution of his assets. He felt that Marcus would be better suited to manage the property and preserve the family legacy. The family legacy, as if Marcus had ever shown the slightest interest in preserving anything except his own comfort. He'd spent the last Christmas dinner complaining about how boring Grandpa's war stories were, scrolling through his phone while our grandfather tried to share memories of his friends who'd never made it home. He'd rolled his eyes when Grandpa had asked him to help move some furniture, claiming his back was sore from his gym routine. But somehow, he was the one suited to preserve our family's legacy. I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA but felt like strangers. My father was already discussing logistics with Marcus, talking about property taxes and maintenance costs like they were planning a business merger. My mother was nodding along, occasionally adding comments about how this arrangement would work out better for everyone involved. Marcus was grinning like he'd won the lottery, which, in a way, he had. The farm alone was worth close to $2 million. The vintage car collection that Grandpa had spent 40 years assembling was worth another $500,000. The military memorabilia, while priceless to our family, had significant collector value. The life insurance policy that would pay off the remaining mortgage and provide ongoing income. Even the small personal items added up to a substantial inheritance, and I was getting nothing. Not because I hadn't earned it, not because I hadn't been there, not because I hadn't loved Grandpa with every fiber of my being, but simply because I was the daughter instead of the son, the caregiver instead of the heir, the one who'd been present instead of the one who'd been absent. Attorney Morrison was still droning on about tax implications and transfer procedures when I stood up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet room. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to complete indifference. "This isn't right," I said, my voice stronger now. "This isn't what Grandpa wanted. He told me himself that he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He said the farm was as much mine as anyone's because I was the one who understood what it meant to him." My father sighed, the same exasperated sound he'd made throughout my childhood whenever I'd questioned their decisions. "Elena, we know this is disappointing, but your grandfather made his choice. We can't change what's already been decided. You're young, you're smart, you'll figure out your own path. You don't need to rely on inheritance to make your way in the world." But Marcus, who'd never held a real job for more than 6 months, who'd never paid his own rent, who'd never contributed anything meaningful to our family or society, apparently deserved to inherit everything our grandfather had worked his entire life to build. The double standard was so obvious it made my stomach turn. But pointing it out would only earn me more lectures about being grateful for what I had and not being jealous of my brother's good fortune. I gathered my purse and headed for the door, but not before taking one last look at the will that had just destroyed my faith in my family's fairness. Something about the signature looked off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly seemed wrong. The handwriting looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the confident script I'd seen Grandpa use when he'd written me letters during my college years. As I walked out of that office and into the cold March afternoon, I made myself a promise. If Grandpa had really wanted Marcus to have everything, I would accept it and move on with my life. But if something wasn't right about this will, if someone had manipulated a dying old man or forged his final wishes, I was going to find out. And when I did, the truth would come out, no matter how much it embarrassed the people who thought they could erase me from my own family's story. Growing up in the Hendricks family meant understanding your place in the hierarchy from an early age. Marcus was the golden child, the future of the family name, the one who could do no wrong even when he did everything wrong. I was the responsible one, the helper, the one who cleaned up messes without expecting credit or thanks. But none of that mattered when Grandpa, Samuel, was around. At his farmhouse, the rules were different. At his place, I wasn't just the daughter who was good at following directions. I was his fishing buddy, his workshop apprentice, his storytelling partner. Grandpa's house sat on 80 acres of rolling hills about 40 minutes outside of town, connected to the main road by a gravel driveway lined with oak trees he'd planted himself in the 1960s. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch had been built by his grandfather in 1923, and every board, every shingle, every doorknob told a story about our family's history. The red barn behind the house was where Grandpa kept his tools, his tractors, and the classic cars he'd been restoring since he came back from Vietnam in 1971. Sunday mornings at Grandpa's house were sacred, while other families were sitting in church pews. We were sitting on his back porch, watching the sunrise paint the hills golden while he made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and I scrambled eggs the way he'd taught me, with just a touch of cream and fresh chives from his garden. He'd tell me about his week, about the volunteer work he was doing at the VA hospital, about the letters he'd received from old Army buddies scattered across the country. I'd tell him about school, about my job at the veterinary clinic, about the plans I was making for my future. He listened to everything with the same attention he gave to his evening news, nodding thoughtfully, asking questions that showed he was really hearing what I said. When I told him I was thinking about going to veterinary school, he didn't ask if I was sure I could handle it or suggest I consider something easier. He asked what kind of animals I wanted to help and how he could support my dream. Marcus rarely joined us for these Sunday morning conversations. He usually slept until noon, then complained about having to drive all the way out to the middle of nowhere just to visit an old man who told the same stories over and over. When he did show up, he spent most of his time on his phone, scrolling through social media or texting friends about whatever party he was planning to attend that night. Grandpa would try to engage him in conversation, asking about his latest job or his plans for the future, but Marcus's answers were always vague and dismissive. "I'm working on some big opportunities, Grandpa," he'd say, never providing any details about what those opportunities actually were. "Just waiting for the right moment to make my move." Grandpa would nod and change the subject, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He'd served his country with honor, worked 40 years as a mechanic to support his family, and built something meaningful with his life. He couldn't understand his oldest grandson's complete lack of ambition or direction. The workshop in the barn was where Grandpa and I spent our best hours together. He'd taught me how to use every tool in that building, from the basic screwdrivers and wrenches to the more complex machinery he used for his restoration projects. We'd work side by side on his cars, him explaining the intricacies of engine repair, while I handed him tools and asked endless questions about how everything worked. "Most people just want to know if their car runs," he'd say, wiping his hands on an old rag stained with decades of motor oil. "But you want to know why it runs, how it runs, what makes it run better. That's the mark of someone who really cares about understanding the world around them." He'd been restoring a 1967 Mustang Fastback for the past 15 years, and it was becoming clear that the car was really a project for both of us. He'd let me do more and more of the work as I got older and more skilled, always supervising, but trusting me with increasingly complex tasks. When we finished rebuilding the engine last summer, he'd looked at me with pride shining in his weathered face. "This car is going to be something special when we're done with it," he'd said. "Something that'll last long after I'm gone. Something that'll remind people that we Hendricks know how to build things that matter." The way he said "we" made it clear that he saw this as our project, not just his. Marcus had never shown the slightest interest in learning about cars or spending time in the workshop. The one time Grandpa had tried to teach him basic maintenance, Marcus had complained about getting his hands dirty and left after 20 minutes. In the house, Grandpa's military service was honored in a way that felt respectful rather than boastful. His Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals were displayed in a simple wooden case on the living room mantel, alongside photographs of his unit and letters from the families of soldiers he'd served with. He didn't talk about the war unless someone asked, and even then, his stories focused more on the friendships he'd formed and the lessons he'd learned than on the violence he'd witnessed. War teaches you what really matters, he'd told me once while we were looking through his photo albums. It's not about the medals or the recognition. It's about taking care of the people around you, doing your job even when it's hard, and coming home with your honor intact. He'd carried those values into civilian life, working as a mechanic for the same garage for 4 decades, serving on the town council for 12 years, and volunteering at the VA hospital every Thursday afternoon. He'd raised 3 children as a single father after my grandmother died in a car accident when my father was 15, working extra shifts and weekend jobs to make sure they all had what they needed for school and college. The farmhouse itself was filled with evidence of Grandpa's life and values. The kitchen walls were covered with photographs of family gatherings, school graduations, military ceremonies, and holiday celebrations spanning 6 decades. The living room bookshelves held everything from military history to classic literature to technical manuals about automotive repair. His desk in the study was organized with military precision, every paper in its proper place, every pen in its designated holder. But it was the personal touches that revealed who Grandpa really was. The wooden jewelry box he'd made for me when I turned 16, carved with intricate flowers and my initials. The framed drawing I'd made of him when I was 8, depicting him in his army uniform with a smile that took up half his face. The collection of rocks and shells I'd brought him from various trips, each one carefully labeled with the date and location where I'd found it. These weren't the belongings of a man who valued one grandchild over another based on gender or birth order. These were the belongings of a man who treasured relationships, who paid attention to the people he loved, who believed in fairness and hard work and treating everyone with respect. When Grandpa started getting sick 2 years ago, it was me who drove him to his doctor's appointments and sat with him during his chemotherapy treatments. Marcus was always too busy with work or travel or social commitments to help out. My parents visited occasionally, bringing flowers and staying for awkward 20-minute conversations about the weather and local news, but they clearly found the hospital environment uncomfortable and depressing. I didn't mind the hospital visits. Grandpa and I would bring crossword puzzles and card games to pass the time during his treatments. He'd tell me more stories about his life, sharing memories he'd never mentioned before about his childhood during the Great Depression, his courtship of my grandmother, his early years as a father trying to figure out how to raise kids on his own. "You remind me of your grandmother," he'd said during one of his treatments, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. "She had the same kind of strength, the same way of taking care of people without making a big show of it. She would have been so proud of the woman you've become." Those words meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. But they also made it impossible to believe that the same man who'd spoken them would have chosen to leave me nothing while giving everything to the grandson who couldn't be bothered to visit him during the most difficult period of his life. The first sign that something was changing came about 6 months before Grandpa passed away. I'd arrived at the farmhouse for our usual Sunday morning routine, carrying fresh bagels from the bakery and a thermos of the special coffee blend he loved. But instead of finding him on the back porch waiting for me with his crossword puzzle and reading glasses, I found him in the kitchen talking quietly on the phone. "I understand your concerns," he was saying, his voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. "But I need to think about what's best for everyone involved. This isn't just about money. It's about responsibility and family legacy." He noticed me standing in the doorway and quickly ended the call, but not before I caught the troubled expression on his face. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he just waved it off and said it was business related to the farm's property taxes. But Grandpa had always been transparent with me about financial matters, often asking for my opinion on decisions about the land or his investments. This sudden secretiveness felt completely out of character. Over the next few weeks, these mysterious phone calls became more frequent. I'd walk into a room and find him speaking in hushed tones, only to have him abruptly change the subject. When he saw me, sometimes I'd catch fragments of conversations that didn't make sense. References to making changes and doing what's expected and considering the future of the family name. The calls seemed to be coming from my parents, though Grandpa never explicitly said so. What struck me as odd was how drained he looked after each conversation. This was a man who'd faced combat in Vietnam, who'd raised 3 children alone after losing his wife, who'd never backed down from a challenge in his life. But these phone calls left him looking defeated and confused. Marcus started showing up more frequently during this period, though not in the way I initially hoped. Instead of joining our Sunday morning traditions or spending quality time with Grandpa, he would arrive unannounced on weekday afternoons when I wasn't there. I'd find evidence of his visits in small details that seemed insignificant at first, but gradually formed a pattern. Grandpa's desk, which had always been meticulously organized, started looking disheveled. Papers were shuffled around, files were left partially open, and his normally precise handwriting appeared on notes that seemed rushed and uncertain. When I asked about the changes, Grandpa would look genuinely confused, as if he couldn't quite remember why he'd moved things or what he'd been looking for. "I've been trying to get my affairs in order," he'd say, rubbing his forehead with the tired gesture of someone carrying too much stress. "Your parents think it's important to make sure everything is properly documented while I'm still thinking clearly." But that was exactly the problem. Grandpa's thinking had always been crystal clear. Even during his cancer treatments, even when the chemotherapy made him physically weak, his mind remained sharp and focused. He could still beat me at chess, still remember obscure historical facts, still solve complicated mechanical problems in the workshop. The suggestion that he needed to rush into legal decisions because his mental clarity was declining seemed not just wrong, but insulting. The workshop visits that Marcus started making were even more puzzling. He'd never shown any interest in the classic cars or restoration projects, but suddenly he was spending hours out there, supposedly helping Grandpa organize tools and evaluate the vehicles. When I'd try to join them, Marcus would find reasons to cut the visits short or suggest that they were handling technical matters that didn't require my input. "Elena doesn't need to worry about all the complicated stuff," he'd say to Grandpa, his tone condescending in a way that made my skin crawl. "You know how she gets overwhelmed when there's too much business talk." Grandpa would look uncomfortable during these exchanges, but he wouldn't contradict Marcus directly. Instead, he'd change the subject or suggest that we all work on something together. But Marcus would inevitably find an excuse to leave, taking Grandpa aside for just a quick private conversation before heading back to town. The most disturbing change was in how my parents started talking about Grandpa's future. During family dinners, they'd make comments about his age and health that felt like they were preparing everyone for some inevitable decline. My mother would worry aloud about whether he was still safe living alone on the farm, despite the fact that he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself and had a network of neighbors who checked on him regularly. "We need to start thinking about what's going to happen to the property," my father would say, as if Grandpa wasn't sitting right there at the table. "It's a big responsibility, and Samuel isn't getting any younger. We need to make sure the right person is ready to take over when the time comes." The right person. Never Elena and Marcus or the grandchildren. Always singular, always implying that this decision had already been made without any input from me, or, more importantly, from Grandpa himself. During one particularly tense dinner conversation, my mother brought up the topic of Grandpa's military memorabilia and classic car collection. She wondered aloud whether these items should be donated to museums or military organizations, since they were probably too valuable and complicated for family members to properly maintain. I watched Grandpa's face during this discussion, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of dying or fear of being sick, but fear of losing control over his own life and possessions. He'd spent decades building this collection, researching the history behind each item, carefully maintaining and preserving pieces that told the story of his service and his values. The idea of having strangers decide the fate of these treasures clearly horrified him. "I haven't decided what I want to do with my things yet," he said quietly, his voice carrying a firmness that reminded me of the strong man he'd always been. "When I'm ready to make those decisions, I'll let everyone know." But my parents exchanged a look that suggested they weren't planning to wait for his readiness. Marcus nodded along with their concerns, adding his own observations about how overwhelming it must be for Grandpa to manage such a large collection, and how much easier his life would be if someone else took responsibility for these burdens. The Sunday mornings that had always been our special time started feeling different too. Grandpa seemed distracted, preoccupied with thoughts he wouldn't share. He'd start sentences and then trail off, as if he'd remembered something that made him reconsider what he was about to say. Our easy conversations became stilted and careful, filled with pauses that felt heavy with unspoken concerns. "Elena," he said to me one morning while we were working on the Mustang, "if something ever happens to me, I want you to know that you've been the light of my life. You've brought me more joy than any old man deserves." The way he said it sounded like goodbye, which frightened me because his health had actually been improving. His latest medical tests had shown that the cancer was in remission, and his doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. There was no medical reason for him to be talking like he was preparing for the end. "Grandpa, you're going to be around for years to come," I told him, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "We still have to finish this car, remember? And you promised to teach me how to rebuild that motorcycle engine you've been saving." He smiled, but it was a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes life doesn't go according to our plans, sweetheart. Sometimes we have to make compromises we never thought we'd have to make." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and went back to work on the engine. That was the last time we had a normal conversation. After that Sunday, every interaction felt strained and artificial, as if we were both acting parts in a play we hadn't auditioned for. The final shift came when Grandpa stopped inviting me to his doctor's appointments. For 2 years, I'd been his primary support system during medical visits, taking notes about treatment options and medication schedules, advocating for his needs when he was too tired to speak up for himself. Suddenly, he said he didn't need my help anymore, that my parents had offered to take over transportation and medical coordination duties. When I called his doctor's office to check on his next appointment, the receptionist told me that only immediate family members were authorized to receive information about his care. When I explained that I was his granddaughter and had been involved in his treatment from the beginning, she apologetically explained that my name had been removed from his authorized contact list at the request of his daughter-in-law. My mother had effectively cut me out of Grandpa's medical care without telling me. When I confronted her about it, she claimed it was for my own good, that I'd been taking on too much responsibility and needed to focus on my own life instead of sacrificing everything for an elderly relative. But I wasn't sacrificing anything. Taking care of Grandpa had been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. Being removed from his care team felt like being told I wasn't family anymore, that my love and dedication counted for nothing compared to whatever plans were being made behind closed doors. The phone call came at 6:47 on a Thursday morning in November. I was getting ready for work when my mother's voice, unusually formal and distant, delivered the news that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. "Elena, your grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. The funeral home has already been contacted, and we've scheduled the service for this Saturday. We thought it would be best to keep things simple and private." Simple and private. 2 words that immediately told me I'd been excluded from decisions about honoring the man who'd been the most important person in my life. I hadn't even known. He was declining. The last time I'd seen him was 3 weeks earlier, when he'd seemed tired but stable. He'd hugged me a little longer than usual when I left that day, but I'd attributed it to his sentimental nature, not to any sense of impending goodbye. Why didn't anyone call me? I managed to ask, my voice barely working through the shock. Why wasn't I there with him? He went very peacefully, my mother repeated, avoiding my actual question. There wasn't time to call anyone. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. But that explanation didn't add up. If he'd died peacefully in his sleep, why were paramedics involved? If there hadn't been time to call anyone, who had discovered his body and contacted emergency services? The more I thought about her words, the more questions arose. But when I tried to ask for details, she quickly changed the subject to funeral arrangements and suggested I focus on preparing for the service rather than dwelling on circumstances I couldn't change. The funeral was held at Morrison Funeral Home, the same place where we'd said goodbye to my grandmother 15 years earlier. But this service felt nothing like the celebration of life that Grandpa would have wanted. Instead of the military honors he'd earned and deserved, instead of stories about his service and his values, instead of the classic country music he'd loved and the readings from the philosophers he'd studied, we got a generic service that could have been for any elderly man. Marcus delivered the eulogy, despite having barely spoken to Grandpa in the months before his death. He talked about family legacy and tradition and responsibility, using phrases that sounded rehearsed and hollow. He mentioned Grandpa's military service in passing, as if his Bronze Star and Purple Heart were minor footnotes rather than symbols of genuine heroism. He talked about the farm and the family business, as if they were burdens that needed to be managed, rather than treasures that had been lovingly maintained. There was no mention of Grandpa's volunteer work at the VA hospital, where he'd spent every Thursday afternoon for the past decade helping younger veterans navigate their benefits and adjust to civilian life. No mention of his 40 years as a mechanic, fixing cars for neighbors who couldn't afford to pay, and never asking for recognition or thanks. No mention of the way he'd raised 3 children alone after losing his wife, working double shifts, and weekend jobs to make sure they had everything they needed. Most painful of all, there was no mention of me. Marcus talked about Grandpa's impact on his family and his hopes for the next generation, but he never specifically acknowledged my relationship with our grandfather or the years I'd spent caring for him. In Marcus's version of events, I simply didn't exist. After the service, while people were gathering in the funeral home's reception area, Attorney Morrison approached me with an expression that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and businesslike. "Miss Hendricks, I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandfather spoke of you often during our meetings. I wonder if you could stop by my office early next week to discuss some matters related to his estate." The way he said it made it clear that this wasn't going to be good news, but I agreed to meet with him the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend in a haze of grief and confusion, trying to process not just the loss of Grandpa, but the strange circumstances surrounding his death and the coldness I'd felt from my family during the funeral arrangements. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matches your mood when everything in your life feels uncertain. Attorney Morrison's office was exactly as I remembered it from previous visits with Grandpa, all dark wood and leather-bound books and the smell of old paper and furniture polish. But this time, instead of sitting beside Grandpa while he reviewed documents or updated his will, I was sitting alone across from a man who was about to destroy my understanding of everything I'd believed about my family. "I'll get straight to the point," Morrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and opening a thick folder. "Your grandfather's final will and testament was executed 6 weeks before his death. The document is quite specific about the distribution of his assets." He began reading from a typed document that bore little resemblance to the handwritten notes and personal touches that had characterized all of Grandpa's previous legal documents. Every asset, every possession, every penny of his estate was designated for Marcus. The farm that I'd helped maintain for years, the classic car collection that we'd worked on together in the workshop, the military memorabilia that told the story of his service and sacrifice, the books and photographs and personal items that connected our family to its history. Even the small things that should have been mine were listed under Marcus's name. The wooden jewelry box that Grandpa had carved specifically for me, with my initials and birth date etched into the lid. The collection of vintage tools that he'd promised would be mine someday, since I was the only grandchild who'd learned to use them properly. The framed photographs of our fishing trips and workshop sessions that had decorated his study for years. There must be some mistake, I said, hearing my own voice as if it were coming from someone else. This can't be right. Grandpa always told me that he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He said the farm was as much mine as anyone's because I understood what it meant to him. Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. The will is quite clear, Miss Hendricks. Your grandfather felt that consolidating the estate under one heir would be the most efficient way to preserve the family legacy. He expressed concern about dividing assets among multiple beneficiaries and wanted to ensure that someone with strong business acumen would be responsible for managing the property and investments. Strong business acumen. Marcus, who'd never held a steady job for more than 6 months, who'd blown through every opportunity our parents had created for him, who'd never shown the slightest interest in the farm or its history, somehow possessed strong business acumen in Grandpa's final assessment. The reading continued with details about life insurance policies, investment accounts, and retirement funds, all designated for Marcus. The total value of the estate was staggering, far more than I'd realized. Grandpa had been careful with money throughout his life, investing wisely and living modestly, and the result was an inheritance worth nearly $3 million. As Morrison explained the various accounts and assets, I found myself focusing on small details that seemed wrong. The signature on the will looked shaky and uncertain, nothing like the confident handwriting I'd seen Grandpa use throughout his life. The language was formal and legalistic, completely different from the personal, heartfelt tone of letters he'd written to me over the years. Most telling of all, there were no personal touches, no specific bequests that reflected his knowledge of what different family members treasured. When was this will signed? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. September 15th, Morrison replied, checking his notes. Your grandfather came in with your parents and brother to finalize the documents. He seemed quite determined to get his affairs in order. September 15th. I remembered that date because it was 3 days after Grandpa had seemed unusually upset following one of his mysterious phone conversations. It was also the day after Marcus had made one of his unannounced visits to the farm, the kind of visit that always left Grandpa looking drained and troubled. Was I supposed to be there? I asked. For the signing, I mean. Was I invited to be present when he made these decisions? Morrison shuffled through his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the question. The invitation list was handled by your family members. I assumed that all interested parties had been notified. But I hadn't been notified. I hadn't even known that a new will was being created. While I'd been driving Grandpa to medical appointments and helping him with daily tasks and believing that we were partners in maintaining his property and preserving his legacy, my family had been meeting with lawyers and making decisions about his future without any input from me. The betrayal cut deeper than just the money or the property. It was the systematic erasure of my relationship with Grandpa, the deliberate exclusion from decisions that should have involved me, and the complete disregard for years of love and sacrifice. They hadn't just taken my inheritance. They'd stolen my place in Grandpa's life and rewritten our history to pretend I'd never mattered to him at all. As I left Morrison's office that afternoon, walking out into the same gray drizzle that had marked the beginning of this nightmare day, I realized that my family had been planning this outcome for months. The mysterious phone calls, the sudden visits from Marcus, the removal of my name from Grandpa's medical contacts, the funeral arrangements that minimized my role in his life. All of it had been leading to this moment when I would be told that the man who'd raised me and loved me and promised to take care of me had chosen to leave me nothing. but something deep in my gut told me that Grandpa hadn't made that choice at all. Someone else had made it for him, and I was going to find out who. The drive home from Attorney Morrison's office felt like moving through a fog of disbelief. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. $3 million, 80 acres of prime farmland, a collection of classic cars worth more than most people's houses, decades of military memorabilia that told the story of our family's service and sacrifice, all of it handed to Marcus, who couldn't even be bothered to visit Grandpa during his final months. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. The November rain drummed steadily on the windshield, creating a rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. I felt like I was drowning in the unfairness of it all, gasping for air in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. When I finally made it inside, my answering machine was blinking with 3 messages. The first was from my mother, her voice artificially bright and cheerful. "Elena, sweetie, I hope your meeting with Mr. Morrison went well. I know this is all very overwhelming, but remember that family is what matters most, not material possessions. Your father and I are here if you need to talk through your feelings about the will. We love you." The second message was from Marcus, and I could hear the smugness in his voice even over the phone's tinny speaker. "Hey sis, just wanted to reach out and make sure you're handling everything okay. I know today was probably tough for you, but Grandpa made his decision and we all need to respect that. If you want to come by the farm sometime to say goodbye to the place, just let me know. I'm planning to start making some changes pretty soon." Changes. He'd owned the property for less than 24 hours and was already talking about making changes to the place Grandpa had lovingly maintained for 50 years. The third message was from my Aunt Rebecca, Grandpa's younger sister who lived in Colorado. Her voice was shaking with what sounded like barely contained anger. "Elena, honey, I just heard about Samuel's will, and I need to talk to you as soon as possible. Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right with me. Your grandfather called me 2 weeks before he died, and he was saying things that don't match what I'm hearing now. Please call me back tonight. This is important." I called her immediately, and she answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Rebecca, it's Elena. I got your message." "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear her voice breaking. "I've been sick to my stomach ever since I heard about that will. Your grandfather was so proud of you, so grateful for everything you'd done for him. He talked about you constantly, about how you were the only one who really understood him, about how he wanted to make sure you were taken care of after he was gone." "What did he say when he called you?" I asked, grabbing a notepad and pen. "He was worried about something. He said your parents had been pressuring him to get his affairs in order, and that Marcus had been coming around asking questions about the farm's value and the car collection. He felt like they were pushing him to make decisions he wasn't ready to make." My hand was shaking as I wrote down her words. "Did he mention anything about changing his will?" "That's just it," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. "He told me he'd already taken care of his will years ago, that everything was set up exactly the way he wanted it. He said he'd made sure you'd inherit the farm because you were the one who loved it and understood its importance. He was adamant about that, Elena. He said wild horses couldn't drag him away from making sure you got what you deserved." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "Are you sure he said that? About me inheriting the farm?" "I'm positive. He also mentioned that he'd hidden copies of important documents somewhere safe, in case anyone tried to interfere with his wishes after he was gone. He said he didn't trust certain family members to do the right thing if he wasn't around to enforce his decisions. Hidden copies of documents. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa would do. He'd always been meticulous about record keeping, and he'd never trusted anyone completely when it came to important matters. If he'd been worried about his will being altered or ignored, he absolutely would have created backup documentation. Do you have any idea where he might have hidden these documents?" I asked. He didn't say specifically, But knowing Samuel, it would be somewhere meaningful to both of you. Somewhere only you would think to look. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to think like Grandpa. Where would a cautious, methodical man hide important papers that he wanted me to find, but no one else to discover? It had to be somewhere at the farm, somewhere that Marcus wouldn't think to search because he'd never spent enough time there to understand the property's hidden corners and secret spaces. My phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. This time it was my mother, and her tone was decidedly less cheerful than her earlier message. "Elena, I heard you've been calling family members and asking questions about your grandfather's will. I think we need to have a conversation about accepting reality and moving forward in a healthy way." "What reality am I supposed to accept?" I asked, no longer caring if I sounded confrontational. "The reality that your grandfather made his choice, and that choice was to leave his estate to Marcus. I know it's not what you wanted to hear, but sometimes life doesn't go according to our plans. You're young and capable. You don't need an inheritance to succeed in life." But Marcus, who was only 18 months older than me and had never demonstrated any capability or ambition, apparently needed a $3 million inheritance to succeed in life. "Did you know he was planning to change his will?" I asked directly. There was a pause that lasted too long. "Your grandfather discussed his concerns with us. Yes, he felt that consolidating the estate would be better for everyone involved. He wanted to make sure the farm and the business interests were managed by someone with the right qualifications." "What qualifications does Marcus have that I don't?" Another pause. "Elena, I don't think this conversation is productive. Your grandfather made his decision, and we all need to respect that. Questioning his judgment at this point is only going to cause more pain for everyone. But I wasn't questioning Grandpa's judgment. I was questioning whether he'd actually made the decision that everyone claimed he'd made." After hanging up on my mother, I called in sick to work for the rest of the week. I needed time to think, to grieve, and to figure out what to do next. The apartment felt too small, too quiet, too removed from everything that mattered. I kept thinking about Grandpa's workshop, about our Sunday morning conversations, about all the places on the farm where we'd shared memories that now felt like they'd been stolen from me. That night, I couldn't eat dinner. I couldn't focus on television or books or anything that might distract me from the weight of what had happened. Instead, I found myself going through old photo albums, looking at pictures of me and Grandpa over the years, birthday parties, fishing trips, graduation, ceremonies, holiday gatherings. In every photo, we looked happy together, like two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and understood each other completely. There was one photo that particularly caught my attention. It was from last Christmas, taken in Grandpa's living room. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, and I was on the floor beside him, both of us laughing at something my cousin had said. But what struck me about the photo wasn't our expressions. It was what was visible in the background. On the table behind Grandpa's chair, there was a stack of papers with his handwriting on the top sheet. I could just barely make out a few words: last will and testament, and what looked like my name. The photo had been taken just 10 months ago, long after the supposed final will had been executed in September. I grabbed a magnifying glass and studied the photo more carefully. The handwriting was definitely Grandpa's, strong and confident. Nothing like the shaky signature I'd seen on the document in Morrison's office. And the paper looked different too, more personal, less formal than the typed pages that had given everything to Marcus. This wasn't proof of anything definitive, but it was evidence that Grandpa had been working on will-related documents much more recently than my family had claimed. It was also evidence that whatever he'd been writing, it had included my name prominently enough to be visible even in a background photo. I spent the rest of the night making lists of questions that needed answers. When had Grandpa actually signed his final will? Who had been present during the signing? Why hadn't I been notified or included in the process? Where were the documents that Aunt Rebecca said he'd hidden? And most importantly, Why did everyone in my family seem so determined to shut down any questions about the will's authenticity? By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to accept this outcome without a fight. If Grandpa had really wanted Marcus to inherit everything, I would learn to live with that disappointment. But if someone had manipulated him or forged his final wishes, if my family had conspired to steal my inheritance and erase my relationship with the man I loved most in the world, then I was going to expose the truth no matter what it cost me. The first step was getting back to the farm to look for those hidden documents. But I'd have to be careful. Marcus had made it clear that he considered the property his now, and my parents had made it equally clear that they didn't want me asking questions or causing trouble. Whatever I found, I'd have to find it quietly and quickly before anyone realized what I was looking for. 3 days after the devastating meeting with Attorney Morrison, I drove out to the farm under the pretense of collecting some personal items that Grandpa had promised me over the years. I'd called Marcus to let him know I was coming, playing the role of the grieving granddaughter who just wanted a few mementos to remember her grandfather by. He'd agreed readily enough, probably relieved that I wasn't challenging the will or causing the kind of family drama he'd been expecting. The November morning was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that Grandpa had always loved for working outside. As I turned into the graveled driveway lined with oak trees, I felt a stab of pain so sharp it nearly took my breath away. This place had been my sanctuary, my second home, the one location where I'd always felt completely understood and valued. Now it felt like a crime scene, a place where something precious had been stolen, and I was searching for evidence of the theft. Marcus's BMW was parked in front of the house, looking absurdly out of place next to Grandpa's old Ford pickup truck. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where Grandpa and I had shared countless Sunday morning breakfasts, scrolling through his phone while drinking coffee from one of the ceramic mugs I'd given Grandpa for his birthday 2 years ago. "Hey, Elena," he said without looking up from his screen. "I figured you'd want some of his books, or maybe some of those old photographs. I'm planning to donate most of this stuff anyway. It's not like I need a bunch of war memorabilia cluttering." Up the house. War memorabilia. He was talking about Grandpa's bronze star and purple heart as if they were garage sale items rather than symbols of genuine heroism and sacrifice. "I'd like to spend some time in his study," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "There are some books he promised me and I want to look through his photo albums." Marcus shrugged. "Whatever you want. Just don't take anything valuable. I mean, I know you wouldn't. But the lawyers said I needed to be careful about the estate. Inventory until everything's officially transferred." I nodded and headed toward Grandpa's study, my heart pounding with a mixture of grief and anticipation. If he'd hidden backup documents somewhere, this room was the most likely place to start. The study had always been his private sanctuary, the place where he'd handled financial matters, written letters to old army buddies, and worked on research projects related to local history and military records. The room looked exactly as it had during my last visit, except for a thin layer of dust that suggested no one had been in here since Grandpa's death. His desk was still organized with military precision, every pen in its proper place, every file folder neatly labeled and arranged alphabetically. The bookshelves that lined 3 walls were packed with everything from technical manuals about automotive repair to classic literature to comprehensive histories of various military campaigns. I started with the desk drawers, carefully searching through folders of financial records, insurance documents, and correspondence with various veterans, organizations. Everything was meticulously organized and properly filed, but nothing jumped out as unusual or hidden. The bottom drawer contained personal items, old photographs, letters from army friends, a small wooden box that held his father's military medals from World War II. As I lifted the wooden box to examine it more closely, I noticed that it felt heavier than it should have for its size. When I opened it, I found not just the expected medals and ribbons, but a small key taped to the inside of the lid. The key was old and brass, the kind that might open a safe deposit box or a small lockbox, but there was no indication of what it was meant to unlock. I slipped the key into my pocket and continued searching. The file cabinets yielded more organized paperwork, tax returns going back decades, property maintenance records, documentation of his various investments, but nothing that contradicted the will I'd seen in Morrison's office. It was when I moved to the bookshelves that I found the first real clue. Behind a row of military history books on the middle shelf, my fingers encountered something unexpected, a manila envelope wedged between the books and the back of the shelf. The envelope was thick and felt like it contained multiple documents. Pulled it out carefully and saw my name written on the front in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. For Elena, in case something happens to me. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents that changed everything I thought I knew about Grandpa's final wishes. The first was a handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, it means my suspicions were correct, and someone has tried to interfere with my final wishes. I've been under tremendous pressure from your parents and Marcus to change my will in ways that go against everything I believe is right and fair. They've made it clear that if I don't comply with their demands, there will be consequences for the whole family. The letter continued. I want you to know that my true intentions have never wavered. You are the grandchild who has shown genuine love and dedication, who has understood the value of hard work and family loyalty, who has earned the right to inherit what I've spent my lifetime building. The farm belongs with you, not because of gender or birth order, but because you're the only one who truly appreciates what it represents. The second document was a photocopy of a will dated 6 months earlier than the one Morrison had shown me. In this version, the estate was divided differently. I inherited the farm and the classic car collection, while Marcus received the financial investments and life insurance policies. It was still generous to both of us, but it recognized my special connection to the property and my years of dedication to maintaining it. The third document was the most shocking of all. It was a typed note, apparently in Marcus's handwriting. That outlined a plan to pressure Grandpa into changing his will. The note mentioned specific tactics, isolating me from medical appointments, convincing Grandpa that I was too emotional to handle financial responsibilities, and suggesting that consolidating the inheritance under one heir would be better for tax purposes. At the bottom of the note was a phone number I didn't recognize, and the name J. Morrison with a question mark beside it. I sat in Grandpa's desk, chair, staring at these documents and trying to process what they meant. The will that Morrison had read to me wasn't just different from what Grandpa had originally intended. It was the result of a deliberate campaign to manipulate him into changing his mind. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. If Grandpa had gone to the trouble of hiding these documents, there might be more evidence stored somewhere else, somewhere that required a key to access. I thought about all the places on the farm where Grandpa might have hidden a lockbox. The workshop had several storage areas and tool chests. The barn had compartments built into the walls for storing equipment. Even the house had a basement where he kept seasonal decorations and old furniture. But then I remembered something specific. 2 years ago, when Grandpa had been updating his insurance policies, he'd mentioned getting a fireproof safe to protect his most important documents. He'd joked about hiding it somewhere that burglars would never think to look, but somewhere, family members would be able to find it if necessary. I looked around the study again, this time focusing on hiding places rather than obvious storage areas. Behind the bookshelf? Too obvious. Under the floorboards? Too difficult for an elderly man to access regularly. Inside the old filing cabinet? Too exposed. Then my eyes fell on the antique trunk that sat beneath the window, the trunk that Grandpa had brought back from Vietnam and that had served as a coffee table for as long as I could remember. I'd always assumed it contained old blankets or seasonal decorations, but I'd never actually looked inside it. I knelt beside the trunk and tried to lift the lid, but it was locked. The brass key from the wooden box slid into the lock perfectly. Inside, the trunk beneath a layer of old quilts that had belonged to my grandmother was a small fireproof safe. And inside that safe was everything I needed to prove that the will Morrison had shown me was not what Grandpa had actually wanted. The fireproof safe contained documents that painted a picture so disturbing I had to read through them twice before I could fully accept what I was seeing. Grandpa hadn't just suspected that someone was trying to manipulate him. He'd been systematically documenting the pressure campaign for months. The first folder contained printed emails between my parents and Marcus, discussing strategies for convincing Grandpa to see reason about his inheritance plans. The messages were dated starting 8 months before his death, which meant this: conspiracy had been brewing since around the time his cancer went into remission, and it became clear he was going to recover. One email from my mother to Marcus was particularly revealing. Your grandfather is being stubborn about dividing the estate. He seems fixated on giving Elena equal treatment, which doesn't make practical sense. We need to help him understand that consolidating everything under your management would be better for the family's long-term stability. Marcus's response was even more calculating. I've been working on him during my visits. He gets confused when I bring up complex financial scenarios. I think we can convince him that Elena isn't equipped to handle major assets. We just need to be consistent with the messaging. Another exchange discussed my removal from Grandpa's medical care team. I've updated his healthcare proxy to exclude Elena. We can't have her interfering when we need to make important decisions about his competency and care options. The second folder contained handwritten notes in Grandpa's careful script, documenting conversations and incidents that now made perfect sense in context. He'd been keeping a record of every suspicious interaction, every inconsistent story, every attempt to isolate him from me or pressure him into decisions he didn't want to make. One entry, dated 3 months before his death, read, Marcus visited again today. Spent 2 hours trying to convince me that Elena is unstable and too emotional to handle inheritance responsibilities. He showed me printouts of what he claimed were her credit card statements and college loan documents, suggesting she's irresponsible with money. When I asked where he got these documents, he became evasive. I don't believe Elena would be careless with finances. She's the most responsible person I know. Another entry was even more disturbing. Phone call from daughter-in-law today. She suggested that if I don't update my estate planning to reflect current realities, there might be problems with Elena's access to family events and relationships. When I asked what she meant, she said it would be unfortunate if Elena felt excluded from family gatherings because of awkwardness about inheritance issues. This felt like a threat. The third folder contained the most damning evidence of all. Documents that proved the will Morrison had shown me was not just different from Grandpa's original intentions, but was potentially fraudulent. There were 2 versions of Grandpa's signature on various documents. The legitimate signature, which appeared on paperwork dating up to 6 months before his death, was strong and confident, with distinctive flourishes on the capital letters. The questionable signature, which appeared on the final will and several related documents, was shaky and uncertain, with none of the characteristic details that had marked his handwriting for decades. More significantly, there was a medical report from Grandpa's doctor dated 1 week after the supposed will signing, noting that his patient was experiencing significant hand tremors and coordination difficulties as side effects from a new medication. If Grandpa had been having trouble with fine motor control, how had he managed to sign a complex legal document just days earlier? The folder also contained a business card for a handwriting analysis expert, along with a note in Grandpa's writing. May need this if they try anything after I'm gone. Elena will know what to do. As I read through document after document, a clear pattern emerged. This wasn't a case of an elderly man changing his mind about his inheritance plans. This was a systematic campaign of manipulation, isolation, and possibly fraud, designed to steal my inheritance and transfer it to Marcus. The timeline was particularly revealing. The pressure had begun almost immediately after Grandpa's cancer went into remission. My parents and Marcus had realized that he was likely to recover and live for several more years, which meant they needed to act quickly to change his estate planning before he had time to reconsider or seek independent legal advice. They'd started by isolating me from his medical care, cutting off my access to information about his health and treatment. Then they'd begun a campaign of character assassination, trying to convince him that I was irresponsible, unstable, and unworthy of inheriting family assets. When those tactics hadn't worked fast enough, they'd escalated to threats and ultimatums, suggesting that my relationship with the family would suffer if Grandpa didn't comply with their demands. Finally, they'd arranged for the signing of a new will under circumstances that were, at best, ethically questionable and, at worst, legally fraudulent. The most heartbreaking part of the documentation was reading Grandpa's growing realization that his own family was conspiring against him. His notes showed a progression from confusion and concern to anger and determination. He'd understood what was happening, but he'd been trapped by his love for all of us and his desire to avoid destroying family relationships. One of his final entries read, "They think I'm too old and sick to fight back, but they're wrong. I've hidden copies of everything Elena will need to prove the truth. She's stronger than they realize, and she won't let them get away with this. I just pray I live long enough to fix this mess before she has to fight this battle alone." I sat in his study, surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, and felt a mixture of grief and rage that was almost overwhelming. Grandpa had known what was happening to him, had documented it carefully, and had tried to protect me from having to discover it after his death. But he'd run out of time before he could expose the conspiracy or restore his original will. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to the present. Marcus was approaching the study, probably wondering what was taking me so long to collect a few personal mementos. I quickly gathered all the documents and slipped them back into the safe, then closed the trunk and stood up just as he appeared. In the doorway, "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp as they scanned the room for signs of what I'd been doing. "Just some photo albums," I replied, holding up a couple of pictures I'd grabbed from the desk. "And a few books he promised me." Marcus nodded, but I could see suspicion in his expression. "You've been in here for a while. Are you sure that's all you wanted?" "I was just remembering," I said, which was partially true. "This room has so many memories of time we spent together." "Yeah, well, don't get too sentimental," Marcus said. "I'm planning to convert this room into a home office. All this old stuff needs to go anyway." As I walked past him toward the front door, carrying my decoy items, I realized that Marcus had no idea what Grandpa had discovered about their scheme. He thought he'd gotten away with it, that the false will would stand unchallenged, and that I would eventually accept the outcome and move on with my life. He was wrong. I had everything I needed to prove what they'd done, and I was going to make sure that Grandpa's real wishes were honored, no matter what it cost me or how much family drama it created. The battle was just beginning. Back in my apartment that evening, I spread Grandpa's hidden documents across my dining room table like pieces of a complex puzzle. The evidence was compelling, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to challenge the will in court without additional proof. I needed to build an airtight case that would expose not just what my family had done, but how they'd done it. The business card for the handwriting analysis expert was my first call. Dr. Margaret Chen had been analyzing questioned documents for 25 years, working with law enforcement agencies and attorneys on cases involving forgery and fraud. When I explained my situation, she agreed to meet with me the following afternoon. "Bring everything you have," she said over the phone. "Legitimate samples of your grandfather's handwriting, the questioned documents, and any medical records that might be relevant to his physical condition around the time of signing." I spent the next morning gathering comparison samples. I had birthday cards Grandpa had written to me over the years, letters he'd sent during my college years, and handwritten notes from our workshop sessions. The contrast between his confident, distinctive script on these legitimate documents and the shaky signature on the contested will was striking even to my untrained eye. Dr. Chen's office was located in a professional building downtown, filled with high-tech equipment for document analysis. She examined the signatures under various types of lighting and magnification, measuring letter formations, pressure patterns, and stroke consistency. "This is very interesting," she said after spending an hour with the documents. "The questioned signature shows several indicators of possible forgery. The pressure is inconsistent, the letter formations are hesitant rather than fluid, and there are microscopic starts and stops that suggest someone was copying rather than writing naturally." She pointed to specific areas under the magnifying glass. "See these tremor patterns? They're not consistent with the medical condition described in your grandfather's health records. Natural tremors from medication side effects would create different types of irregularities. These look more like the hesitation marks you see when someone is trying to carefully reproduce another person's handwriting." Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis wasn't definitive proof of forgery, but it was strong enough to warrant further investigation. She agreed to prepare a detailed report that could be used in legal proceedings, but warned me that challenging a will based on signature analysis alone would be difficult. "You'll need more evidence," she explained. "Witnesses, documentation of mental state, proof of undue influence. Handwriting analysis is powerful supporting evidence, but courts usually want to see a broader pattern of misconduct." My next step was tracking down the mysterious J. Morrison mentioned in Marcus's notes. Attorney Morrison, who'd read the will, was Robert Morrison, but the initial J suggested there might be another Morrison involved in the process. A quick internet search revealed Janet Morrison, a paralegal who worked for a different law firm across town. I called her office, pretending to be a potential client seeking estate planning services. When I mentioned that I'd been referred by Marcus Hendricks, her response was immediate and telling. "Oh, Marcus," she said, her voice becoming noticeably warmer. "Yes, we worked together on that project for his grandfather. Such a complicated situation, but we were able to help the family resolve everything efficiently." She'd essentially admitted to being involved in the will preparation without realizing she was talking to the person who'd been cut out of the inheritance. I recorded the conversation on my phone, another piece of evidence for my growing case. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been trying to figure out how my family had obtained copies of my personal financial information that Marcus had supposedly shown to Grandpa. My credit reports and student loan documents were private, and accessing them without permission would be illegal. I contacted the credit reporting agencies to request copies of my files, including logs of who had accessed my information. The results were shocking. Someone using Marcus's social security number had pulled my credit reports multiple times over the past year, claiming to be a potential employer conducting background checks. This was identity theft, a federal crime that carried serious penalties. Marcus had not only conspired to steal my inheritance, but had committed additional crimes in the process of building his case against me. Armed with this new evidence, I scheduled a meeting with David Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in estate litigation. Rodriguez had a reputation for taking on difficult cases and wasn't intimidated by wealthy families who thought they could manipulate the legal system. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud schemes I've seen in estate planning," Rodriguez told me after reviewing all my documentation. "Your family didn't just pressure your grandfather into changing his will. They orchestrated a multi-layered campaign involving forgery, identity theft, undue influence, and possible elder abuse." He explained that we had several legal avenues to pursue. We could challenge the validity of the will based on the handwriting analysis and medical evidence. We could file criminal complaints for the identity theft and potential forgery. We could also pursue civil claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress and conspiracy. "The strength of your case lies in your grandfather's own documentation," Rodriguez explained. "He essentially did our investigative work for us. His notes and the emails he preserved show clear intent to defraud you of your rightful inheritance. But Rodriguez also warned me about the challenges ahead. Your family will have expensive attorneys, and they'll try to paint this as a family dispute rather than criminal fraud. They'll claim your grandfather changed his mind legitimately and that you're just a disappointed heir causing trouble. We developed a strategy that would build our case methodically while avoiding actions that might tip off my family about what we'd discovered. Rodriguez would file preliminary motions to preserve evidence and prevent Marcus from disposing of estate assets while we prepared our main challenges. Meanwhile, I would continue gathering evidence, particularly focusing on witnesses who could testify about Grandpa's mental state and the family dynamics leading up to his death. I reached out to Dr. Patricia Wells, Grandpa's primary physician, who remembered the unusual circumstances around his final months. Your grandfather was sharp as a tack mentally, she told me during a confidential phone conversation. His physical symptoms from the medication were limited to hand tremors and some fatigue. There was never any cognitive impairment that would have affected his decision-making capacity. She also remembered being surprised when my mother suddenly took over his medical care coordination. Your grandfather had specifically told me that you were his primary contact for health matters. When that changed abruptly, I assumed there had been some family discussion I wasn't aware of. The Veterans Affairs Hospital where Grandpa had volunteered also provided crucial testimony. The volunteer coordinator, Michael Torres, had worked with Grandpa every Thursday for 3 years. Samuel was one of our most reliable volunteers right up until the end, Torres explained. He was helping other veterans navigate their benefits, which requires significant attention to detail and understanding of complex regulations. If he'd been experiencing any cognitive decline, we would have noticed it immediately. Torres also remembered Grandpa mentioning concerns about his family situation. He seemed worried about something during his last few visits. He said he was dealing with some family pressure, but didn't go into details. He did mention that he was grateful to have one grandchild who really understood him, and that he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. Each piece of evidence strengthened our case, but I knew the real test would come when we confronted my family with what we'd discovered. They'd built their scheme carefully, counting on my grief and shock to prevent me from questioning the wills. Legitimacy. They were about to learn that they'd seriously underestimated both my determination and Grandpa's foresight in documenting their betrayal. 3 weeks into my investigation, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Mrs. Dorothy Evans, Grandpa's next-door neighbor for the past 15 years. She'd heard through the local grapevine that there had been some complications with his estate, and she had something important to tell me. "Elena, honey, I've been wrestling with whether to call you," she said, her elderly voice shaking slightly. "But I can't sleep at night knowing what I witnessed and not speaking up. Your grandfather would want me to tell the truth." Mrs. Evans invited me to her house that afternoon. Her living room window had a direct view of Grandpa's front porch and driveway, and she'd been an inadvertent witness to much of what had transpired during his final months. "I saw those visits from your brother and parents," she explained, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. "The timing was always strange. They'd come when you weren't there, usually on weekdays when most people are working, and your grandfather would look so upset after they left." She described specific incidents that corroborated Grandpa's hidden notes. "One day in September, I watched your brother pace around the front porch for 20 minutes, talking on his phone. He seemed agitated, like he was arguing with someone. Then he went inside, and I could hear raised voices through the windows. Not yelling exactly, but tense conversation." Mrs. Evans had been particularly concerned about the day Grandpa supposedly signed his final will. 3 cars showed up that morning. Your parents, your brother, and someone in a dark sedan I didn't recognize. They were all inside for about 2 hours. When they came out, your grandfather was leaning heavily on his walking stick, which was unusual. He normally only used that when he was having a really bad day with his arthritis. Even more disturbing was what she'd observed after the group left. I went over to check on Samuel because he looked so distressed. He was sitting on his porch, just staring at nothing, When I asked if he was all right, he said something I'll never forget. "Dorothy, sometimes family can be more dangerous than enemies because they know exactly how to hurt you." Mrs. Evans had additional evidence that proved invaluable to my case. She'd been taking photographs of her garden throughout the summer and fall, and several shots inadvertently captured activity at Grandpa's house. One photo, taken the morning of the supposed will signing, clearly showed all 4 people entering the house together, with Grandpa looking visibly distressed. But the most damning evidence came from her security camera system. Her son had installed cameras around her property after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood, and the system had been recording continuously for the past year. "I never thought to mention this before," she said, "but the cameras pick up part of your grandfather's driveway. If you think it would help, we could look through the recordings from around that time." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing footage from the critical period. The recordings confirmed Mrs. Evans's observations and provided precise timestamps for all the suspicious visits. More importantly, they captured audio from some of the conversations that had taken place on Grandpa's front porch. In one particularly clear recording from early September, we could hear Marcus saying, "Grandpa, you need to be realistic about this. Elena's going to cause problems for the family if she inherits the farm. She doesn't understand business like I do, and she'll probably lose everything within a few years." Grandpa's response was firm. "Elena has been more dedicated to this property than anyone else in the family. If anyone deserves to inherit it, it's her." Marcus's voice became more aggressive. "Well, that's not what Mom and Dad think. They're worried about what will happen to the family legacy if you don't make the right choice here." Another recording from a week later captured an even more troubling exchange. My mother's voice was clearly audible. "Samuel, we've all talked about this, and we think it would be best if Marcus handled the estate. Elena is still young and emotional. She might make impulsive decisions that could hurt everyone." Grandpa's response was weaker this time, showing the effect of their sustained pressure campaign. "I just want what's fair for both of them." "Fair doesn't always mean equal," my mother replied, unknowingly echoing the exact phrase from the original story that had inspired my search for truth. Sometimes doing what's right for the family means making difficult choices. The recordings also captured the day of the will signing. We could hear Attorney Morrison's voice as he arrived, followed by what sounded like a tense discussion inside the house. Most significantly, we could hear Grandpa's voice becoming increasingly distressed as the morning progressed. "I'm not sure about this," he said at one point. "This doesn't feel right. Elena should be here for something this important." My father's voice responded, "Elena is too emotional for this kind of discussion. You said yourself that she gets upset when we talk about your mortality. This is better handled among the adults who can think clearly about financial matters." Mrs. Evans also provided testimony about Grandpa's mental state during his final weeks. "He seemed very worried about something, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Just last week before he passed, he was helping me figure out a problem with my property taxes that had been confusing me for months. He worked through all the calculations and caught an error that would have cost me hundreds of dollars." The neighbor's evidence was devastating to my family's claims that Grandpa had been declining mentally, or that his decision to change his will had been made freely and without coercion. The recordings proved that he'd been pressured, isolated from me during crucial decisions, and had repeatedly expressed doubts about what he was being asked to do. Armed with this new evidence, my attorney Rodriguez filed formal challenges to the will's validity. We submitted the handwriting analysis, the medical records showing Grandpa's cognitive abilities were intact, the documentation of identity theft, and now the audio recordings and witness testimony from Mrs. Evans. The legal filings had to be served to my family, which meant they would finally discover that I wasn't accepting the fraudulent will quietly. Rodriguez warned me to expect immediate pushback and possibly aggressive tactics designed to intimidate me into dropping the challenges. He was right. Within 24 hours of the filings being served, I received angry phone calls from both my parents and Marcus. The tone was no longer patronizing or dismissive, it was threatening. "Elena, you need to stop this nonsense immediately," my father said during a particularly heated call. "You're embarrassing the family and wasting everyone's time and money. Grandpa made his decision, and you need to accept it." When I tried to explain that I had evidence of fraud, he cut me off. "I don't want to hear your conspiracy theories. If you continue with this vindictive behavior, you'll find yourself completely cut off from this family." Marcus was even more direct in his threats. "You have no idea what you're messing with here," he said. "Drop this lawsuit or I'll make sure. Everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. I have information that could destroy your reputation and your career." But their threats only confirmed what I already knew. They were guilty of everything I'd accused them of, and they were panicking because their carefully constructed fraud was falling apart. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, the paralegal who'd inadvertently admitted her involvement in preparing the fraudulent will, made a crucial mistake. Under pressure from my attorney's subpoena, she turned over her files related to the estate planning work. Among those files was a draft version of the will that contained handwritten notes in the margins. The notes were in Marcus's handwriting and included specific instructions about which assets should go to him and comments about making sure Elena doesn't get anything she doesn't deserve. The draft also contained a memo outlining the strategy for convincing Grandpa to sign the new will, including talking points about my supposed financial irresponsibility and emotional instability. It was a roadmap for manipulation that perfectly matched the tactics Grandpa had documented in his own hidden notes. With this final piece of evidence in place, we had everything we needed to prove our case. The truth was finally assembled, documented, and ready to be presented in court. My family's elaborate fraud was about to be exposed, and Grandpa's real wishes were finally going to be honored. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Instead of waiting for our court date, my family decided to force a family meeting to resolve this matter privately. The invitation came through my mother, delivered in her most diplomatic tone, but the underlying message was clear: show up and accept their terms or face the consequences. They chose to hold the meeting at the farm, which felt like a calculated power move. Marcus wanted to demonstrate his ownership of the property while pressuring me to back down in the place that held the most emotional significance for me. What they didn't know was that I'd been hoping for exactly this opportunity. Arrived on a cold Saturday morning in December, carrying a simple briefcase that contained copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. My attorney Rodriguez had wanted to be present, but I'd convinced him that this first confrontation needed to happen within the family. If they were going to have any chance to come clean and make this right voluntarily, it had to be without lawyers present initially. The scene in Grandpa's living room was surreal. My parents sat on the sofa where Grandpa used to read his evening newspaper, looking stern and uncomfortable. Marcus had positioned himself in Grandpa's favorite armchair, a piece of symbolism so obvious it was almost laughable. Attorney Morrison was there as well, which surprised me until I realized they'd probably called him in to provide legal intimidation. "Elena," my mother began, using the tone she'd perfected for managing difficult situations. "We're all here because we care about you and want to help you work through your grief in a healthy way. This obsession with challenging your grandfather's will isn't good for you or for the family. We understand you're disappointed," my father added, "but your grandfather made his choice for good reasons. Marcus is better positioned to handle the responsibilities that come with this inheritance, and everyone will be better off if we can move forward without unnecessary conflict." I let them finish their prepared speeches before I opened my briefcase. "I'm not here to argue about Grandpa's choices," I said calmly. "I'm here to discuss what actually happened during his final months, based on evidence that I think you'll find very interesting." The first document I placed on the coffee table was Grandpa's handwritten letter, the one that began, "My dearest Elena, If you're reading this, it means my suspicions were correct. I watched their faces as I read the opening paragraph aloud, and saw the exact moment when they realized their carefully constructed story was falling apart. Marcus was the first to recover his composure. That letter doesn't prove anything. Grandpa was sick and confused during his final weeks. He was probably paranoid and suspicious of everyone. I pulled out Dr. Wells's medical records and the testimony from the VA hospital volunteer coordinator. Actually, multiple witnesses can testify that Grandpa was completely lucid and mentally sharp right up until his death. His medication caused hand tremors, not cognitive impairment. Attorney Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Hendricks, even if your grandfather had concerns about family pressure, that doesn't invalidate a legally executed will. Families often have difficult conversations about estate planning. That's when I played my strongest card. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the portable speaker I'd brought, then played the clearest audio recording from Mrs. Evans's security system. My family's own voices filled the room, captured in the act of pressuring and manipulating Grandpa. The recording of my mother saying, "Fair doesn't always mean equal," and my father claiming I was too emotional for important discussions played through the speaker with crystal clarity. Marcus's voice threatening that I would cause problems for the family if I inherited the farm was particularly damning. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face had gone completely pale, and my father was staring at the floor, as if he could disappear into it. Marcus looked like he was calculating whether he could somehow brazen his way out of this situation. "Where did you get those recordings?" my mother finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Evans has security cameras," I explained. "She's been very helpful in documenting exactly what happened during Grandpa's final months. She's also prepared to testify about his mental state and the distress he showed after your visits." I continued pulling documents from my briefcase. The handwriting analysis report that questioned the authenticity of Grandpa's signature on the final will. The evidence of Marcus accessing my credit reports illegally. The draft will with Marcus's handwritten notes about making sure Elena doesn't get anything she doesn't deserve. With each new piece of evidence, my family sank deeper into their chairs. Attorney Morrison looked like he wanted to flee the room, probably realizing that his firm could face serious ethical violations for their role in executing a potentially fraudulent will. "The identity theft alone is a federal crime," I said, looking directly at Marcus. "You used your social security number to access my personal financial information without permission. That's not a family dispute. That's criminal fraud." My father finally found his voice. "Elena, even if there were some irregularities in how this was handled, destroying the family isn't going to bring your grandfather back. We can work out some kind of arrangement that gives you a portion of the estate." "I don't want a portion of the estate," I replied. "I want Grandpa's actual wishes to be honored. The will he really wanted, not the one you forced him to sign under duress." I pulled out the final document, the photocopy of Grandpa's legitimate will, the one that divided the estate fairly, and left me. The farm that I'd helped maintain for years. This is what he actually intended. This is what we're going to court to establish if you force us to. Marcus finally exploded. "You can't prove any of this. So what if we had some conversations about the will? Families discuss these things all the time. You're just a bitter, jealous sister who can't accept that Grandpa chose me over you?" I played another audio clip, this one capturing Grandpa's voice, clearly stating his doubts about the changes they were pressuring him to make. "I'm not sure about this. This doesn't feel right. Elena should be here for something this important. Your own voices are on these recordings," I said quietly, pressuring him, isolating him from me, and manipulating him into signing documents he didn't want to sign. Mrs. Evans watched it happen from her window, and her security system recorded your conversations. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat, nervously. "Perhaps we should adjourn this meeting and schedule a more formal discussion with all parties represented by counsel." That's exactly what's going to happen, I agreed. My attorney has already filed challenges to the will's validity. We have handwriting experts, medical testimony, witness statements, and audio evidence. Unless you want to face criminal charges, for fraud and elder abuse, I suggest you start thinking about how to make this right. I stood up and began packing my evidence back into the briefcase. Grandpa knew what you were doing to him. He documented everything because he knew you'd try to get away with it after he died. But he also knew that I wouldn't let you erase his real wishes or steal what he wanted me to have. As I walked toward the door, my mother called out desperately, "Elena, please. We're family. We can work this out without destroying each other." I turned back to face them one last time. You stopped being my family the day you decided to betray Grandpa and steal my inheritance. But unlike you, I'm going to let the truth speak for itself in court. The look of defeat on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They'd gambled that I would accept their fraud quietly, and they'd lost. The truth was finally coming out, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fallout from the family confrontation was swift and brutal. Within hours of my leaving the farm, my phone started ringing with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Word was spreading through the family network like wildfire, and everyone wanted to know if the rumors they were hearing could possibly be true. My cousin Jennifer called first, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Elena, Mom just called me crying. She said there are recordings of Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia pressuring Grandpa to change his will. Please tell me this isn't real." I found myself in the strange position of having to confirm that yes, our family members had conspired to commit fraud, and yes, I had proof of everything they'd done. Each conversation was emotionally exhausting, but it was also liberating to finally tell the truth after months of being gaslighted and manipulated. Uncle Tom, Grandpa's younger brother who lived in Arizona, called that evening. His voice was filled with rage. I knew something was wrong when I talked to Samuel a few weeks before he died. He sounded defeated, like someone had broken his spirit. I asked him if everything was okay with the family, and he just said, "Some battles aren't worth fighting, Tom." Uncle Tom had additional information that strengthened my case. "Your grandfather called me about a month before he passed away. He was worried about some documents he thought might be missing from his file cabinet. He said he'd been keeping copies of important papers in a safe place because he didn't trust everyone with access to his house." More family members came forward with similar stories. Aunt Rebecca confirmed that Grandpa had called her multiple times during his final months, expressing concerns about family pressure and asking her opinion about estate planning. She'd encouraged him to do whatever felt right to him, not what others expected. "He told me he was torn between keeping peace in the family and doing what was fair," she said during a long phone conversation. "I told him that fairness should always win over peace, because peace built on injustice never lasts anyway." The most significant call came from Grandpa's old Army buddy, Frank Morrison, no relation to the attorney. Frank lived in California, but had maintained regular contact with Grandpa through letters and occasional phone calls. "Samuel wrote to me about 6 weeks before he died," Frank said. "He was upset about something involving his will and his family. He said he felt like he was being pushed into making decisions that went against his conscience. He asked me to pray for him to have the strength to do the right thing." Frank still had Grandpa's letter, which provided additional evidence of his mental state and his concerns about family pressure. The letter was dated after the supposed final will signing, which meant Grandpa was still actively troubled by what had happened and was looking for ways to address the situation. Meanwhile, my parents and Marcus were scrambling to contain the damage. Marcus hired his own attorney, an expensive defense lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime. The fact that he felt he needed criminal defense representation told me everything about how seriously he was taking the fraud allegations. My mother tried a different approach. She began calling extended family members, attempting to control the narrative and portray me as an unstable, money-hungry opportunist who was destroying the family over greed. But her efforts backfired because Too many people had heard the audio recordings by then. Cousin Jennifer had shared the recordings with her mother, who shared them with her sisters, who shared them with their children. The evidence was spreading through the family network faster than my mother could spread her alternative version of events. My father took yet another approach. He showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening, looking haggard and desperate. He'd clearly been drinking, which was unusual for him. "Elena, you have to understand," he said, slumping onto my couch uninvited. "We didn't mean for things to get this complicated. We just thought it would be simpler if Marcus handled everything. We never intended to hurt you." "You stole my inheritance and committed multiple felonies in the process," I replied. "How did you think that wouldn't hurt me?" "We thought you'd be fine," he said, his voice slurring slightly. "You're smart and capable. You don't need our help to succeed in life. Marcus, he's different. He needs more support, more structure. We were trying to help him." The admission was stunning. He'd essentially confessed that they'd stolen from me to subsidize Marcus's inability to support himself. They'd decided I was strong enough to overcome injustice while Marcus was too weak to earn his own way in the world. "Dad, you committed fraud," I said firmly. "You manipulated a dying man, forged legal documents, and stole millions of dollars. That's not helping Marcus. That's destroying your own integrity and teaching him that he doesn't have to work for anything he wants." He left shortly after, but not before making one final desperate plea. "If you drop this lawsuit, we'll give you half of everything. Marcus keeps the farm, but you get half the money and half the investments. That's more than fair." But it wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about truth and accountability and honoring Grandpa's real wishes. Besides, their offer was meaningless. They were attempting to negotiate with assets they'd stolen in the first place. The legal pressure was also mounting. My attorney Rodriguez had filed criminal complaints with the district attorney's office, and federal investigators were looking into the identity theft charges. The original attorney Morrison was cooperating with authorities to avoid prosecution for his role in executing the fraudulent will. Most significantly, the paralegal Janet Morrison had agreed to testify about her involvement in drafting the false will. Under pressure from prosecutors, she'd revealed that Marcus had specifically instructed her to create a document that would exclude me from the inheritance entirely. He said his sister was problematic and that the family wanted to make sure she couldn't challenge their decisions, she told investigators. He provided specific language about her being too emotional and financially irresponsible to justify excluding her from the estate. The media had also gotten wind of the story. A local newspaper reporter had heard about the criminal charges and was investigating the case. The story had all the elements that made for compelling journalism: a decorated veteran's final wishes being betrayed by his own family, forged documents, secret recordings, and a granddaughter fighting for justice. When the article was published, it included quotes from Mrs. Evans, Uncle Tom, and several other family members who supported my version of events. The headline read, "Local Veterans Estate Disputed After Granddaughter Uncovers Alleged Fraud." The public attention put additional pressure on my parents and Marcus to resolve the case quickly. Their reputations in the community were being destroyed, and Marcus's business prospects were evaporating as word spread about the criminal charges. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from the current residents of the nursing home where Grandpa had volunteered. They'd heard about the legal battle and wanted me to know that they were supporting my efforts to honor his memory. "Your grandfather talked about you all the time," said Maria Santos, one of the veteran counselors. "He was so proud of your dedication to him and to preserving his property. He would have been heartbroken to know that his family tried to steal your inheritance, but he would have been so proud to see you fighting for the truth. That validation meant more to me than any legal victory could." The people who had known Grandpa best, who had worked with him and understood his values, knew that what my family had done was wrong. They knew that I was fighting not for money, but for justice, and for the memory of a man who had deserved better from his own family. The momentum was building toward a resolution, but I knew my family wouldn't surrender easily. They had too much to lose and too much pride to admit defeat gracefully. The final confrontation was still ahead. 2 weeks before our scheduled court date, my family's attorney called Rodriguez with a settlement offer. They wanted to avoid criminal prosecution and public trial, agreeing to restore Grandpa's original will in exchange for dropping the fraud charges. Marcus would keep the financial investments, but I would inherit the farm, the classic cars, and all of Grandpa's personal belongings, exactly what Grandpa had originally intended. More importantly, they would publicly acknowledge that the contested will had been executed under questionable circumstances. I accepted the settlement, not because I was satisfied with the outcome, but because Grandpa would have wanted his family to heal rather than destroy each other completely. The criminal charges remained active. That was out of my hands. But at least his real wishes were finally being honored. The day I got the keys back to the farmhouse was bittersweet. Walking through Grandpa's workshop, seeing his tools exactly where he'd left them, I felt his presence strongly. I found a note tucked inside his toolbox, written in his careful handwriting. Elena, if you're reading this, you fought for what was right. I'm proud of you. 6 months later, I've restored the farmhouse and opened it as a retreat center for veterans and their families. The classic car collection has become a working museum where I teach restoration skills to young people, just like Grandpa taught me. His legacy lives on, not in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the values he instilled and the truth he trusted me to defend. My parents and Marcus rarely speak to me now, but I've found peace in knowing I honored the man who believed in me when it mattered most. Sometimes doing what's right costs you everything you thought you wanted, but gives you everything you actually need. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more stories about people who refuse to let the truth stay buried. Your support helps me continue sharing these important tales of justice and courage.